Hello and welcome back. This is your panel here. Thank you, Ron, for putting together that interesting first time manager presentation. And we have a few questions we thought of ahead of time, and people who aren't able to attend this video sent to me. And let me take a few moments here and ask you those. So one of the things you talked about was your team's psychological safety. Well, can you talk a little bit more about that, and how do you actually build psychological safety?
Yeah, I think it's let me start with a couple of a little bit more in depth. So Esther Derby, who is the co-author of Agile Retrospectives, making good teams great, explains that psychological safety does not mean that you feel comfortable all the time. Psychological safety is that you feel comfortable talking about what makes you feel uncomfortable. I think that's a helpful way to understand psychological safety. Amy Edmondson, who's that professor who I brought up from Harvard, and who has studied psychological safety inside and out, she cites 4 reasons why people don't speak up. They don't want to be seen as ignorant, incompetent, negative, or disruptive. So what that means is that as leaders, we need to be vulnerable ourselves. And we need to share who we are in the way that will allow other people to share who they are. So to start with, as for us, as managers and as leaders, we need to admit when we're wrong. There's actually an agile practice called a failure bow, in which you admit your mistakes. So I'll admit not looking into the camera. So Peter's been coaching me for this session. I'm looking into the camera, and I look off and not looking into. So I'm gonna stand up and take a failure bow to all of you to whom I've not been looking into the camera at. And the way the agile practice works is that everyone then applauds the person taking the failure bow, and it's a way of being celebrated for having a failure, and also a way of cementing the fact that I want to do better. I want to do better. I the person taking the failure bow, and I think that can be helpful. We want to share with our reports our failures and our learnings, and I actually learned this being a parent with my kids. When they moved into junior high and high school and began getting totally skeptical of their parents. And so those of you who don't have kids probably remember that period of being skeptical with your parents. One of the things, so telling them what to do at that point is a difficult way to get them to do things. But it can be helpful to say, to share with them the failures that you had as a kid, and the result of those things, and say, well, you could do it like I did, and this is what the results were. So sharing your failures can be a very useful way of giving examples, as well as sharing, creating an environment of psychological safety. Hey, I'm willing to be vulnerable here. I'm willing to tell you what I did wrong. And then there's something called the prime directive for retrospectives. So those of you, probably all of you, are doing agile in some way or another. What that means is that probably all of you are doing retrospectives in some way or another. And the man who wrote about retrospectives before agile, Norm, and I forget his last name, but look for retrospective, Google retrospective prime directive, and what you'll see there is a prime directive that some of us read at the beginning of our retrospectives, because it reminds us that if we knew when we started the sprint, or if we knew when we started the project what we know now, we wouldn't have made those mistakes. But we did make some mistakes along the way, and instead of blaming ourselves and blaming each other for those mistakes, we need to celebrate the learnings that came from those. And so all of these, whether it's admitting mistakes, or whether it's modeling curiosity, and modeling asking questions, and maybe even modeling asking dumb questions, admitting when we don't know something. So when somebody throws out an abbreviation or an acronym, asking what is that? And sometimes they're the most obvious things, but it's helpful to everyone else because there's probably somebody else in the room who doesn't know what it is either. So all of those, and not blaming as well. So all of those are ways of creating psychological safety on our teams.
And that makes a lot of sense when you're the leader, the manager, sort of leading the team. Another follow-on question that we just got in the chat is it possible to build psychological safety when your supervisor, manager, or your organization doesn't really care about it?
So I think that all of us can contribute to building psychological safety from where we are. Now, there's one of the things we talk about in the book is creating. We've got a whole chapter on creating culture and creating a software development culture. And one of the things that we talk about is that it starts from understanding your corporate culture, your company culture. What is that company culture? And that starts from looking at what are the company's values and mission, and then is the company living up to its values and mission? So we know that Enron had, so those of you who remember Enron had wonderful values. The fact is that they operated at a 180-degree difference from those values, but they had wonderful values. And one of the things we can do is we can leverage those values, and we can leverage those values whether we're the leaders or whether we're individual contributors by saying, one of our values is fairness. One of our values is delivering value to our customers. One of our values is, and we can use that value as leverage to building the culture that we want, including building a culture of psychological safety.
And maybe a follow-on to this is in your presentation, you talk about managing up or managing your manager. Can you talk a little bit more about what does that mean to manage my manager?
Yeah, so there's a rule of thumb, and there's a rule of thumb, and I shared it during the presentation that perception is reality, and the fact is that your manager's perception about you and about your team is reality, and managing your manager means managing the perception that your manager has of you and your team, and helping your manager to understand the value add that you have and the value add that your team has for the mission of the company. And so you're managing, you're managing perception.
You're managing perception. Can you talk a little bit more? How do you manage perception?
PR. You explain the contribution that you're making. You explain the contribution your team is making. You make the connection, and we need to do this with the people who work for us as well. Make the connection between what's the company's mission, what's the difference that our company is making in the world, and what's the difference that each of the individuals on our team is making. And sometimes we need to mirror that back to our managers when we're managing up.
Ron, let me just jump in here for a second. The other thing you can do, it's important to do in managing up, is understand what kind of communications your manager wants. Giving them too much information or too little information, both of them are bad. So you have to figure out exactly what the right thing is, make sure you're giving them the right amount at the right times. That's an important ingredient in managing up.
Yeah, a great point, Mickey. I had a manager at Schwab, actually, who new manager. My métier is not phone calls, and every morning about 6 o'clock in the morning on her commute into San Francisco, she was leaving me a voicemail, a long voicemail that, and it took me a while. But that's the trigger. That's what we have to listen for, is what is our manager's mode of communication. And in this particular case, her mode of communication was leaving me voicemails, and mine needed to be leaving her voicemails back.
So maybe
I think it's also really important for us to understand what it is that our manager is being graded on, what it is that our manager is going to be rewarded for. We need to understand what their objectives are and how we can, and how what we do contribute to those objectives. And it's a very
Delivering a
different
project on time.
Yeah, yeah, for one. One of the there's a ton of objectives, and when we're programmers, you know, it's pretty clear. You know, we've got a bunch of programming to do to make that contribution. As managers, that becomes much less clear and much more nebulous.
So maybe you could talk a little bit about reflective listening. Does that get, maybe that's part of what you're getting to, is this reflective listening skill, and how is reflective listening any different than I'm just listening to you?
So Tammy, what I'm hearing you ask is, what's the difference between just listening and reflective listening? Is that the question?
That's the question. Have you just answered my question?
Yes.
Okay.
So reflective listening is listening actively, playing that back to the person you're talking to, getting them to give you validation that what you heard is what they said, and or correcting or giving you insight into what the real question was, or what the real statement was, or what the real comment was. And reflective listening, as I said, was part of a number of classes that I took at Apple and at Fujitsu and at Schwab, the three very large corporations that I worked for that had classes for managers. And reflective listening was something that my wife very much appreciated my having learned a little bit more of. I'm still not, I wish I were better at it still, but I'm way better than I used to be.
It feels like it could almost be a little stilted. Is that this reflective listening? Like, yeah, I just told you that. Why are you telling me it again? Do you find that that's the case, or this actually works in a more natural sense?
And so I find that people who are speaking to me when I'm being reflective are actually appreciative that I've either heard what it is that they're saying, or that I'm playing it back because it's not what it is that they were trying to get at. It's not the thing that was most important to them in saying what they said.
However, you can't do it all the time, or it would become annoying.
Yeah, that's true too.
Okay. One of the things you talk about, Ron, is an important criteria for a product is to ensure that people love your product. And as an engineering manager, I could think, well, that's interesting, but that's really not my job as the engineering manager. That's the job of the product manager who works with sales and all the other organizations. And they're the ones that really dial in and need to understand customer love and reflect it back to me. How can I, as an engineering manager, feel much ownership for my customer loving my product?
So I'm gonna contend, Tammy, that all of us in the product organization, developers, testers, UX designers, product managers, are responsible for customer delight. We're all responsible for quality of the product, and we're all responsible for customer delight. And our product, what we count on our product managers for, and I love product managers for the fact that I hope they have time, and they're spending a third or more of their time with customers, truly understanding customers and being able to say, well, what's going to delight them is this nuance, or that way of creating the product, or this way of designing the user interaction with us. And so UX designers and product managers essentially bring the customer, the proxies for customers. They bring customers into the room for all of us who are engineering managers and engineers and designers and testers, all of us, to understand how we can make that spark of delight in our customers.
Okay. So listen to your overall conversation, your overall presentation. You talk about all of the challenges that first-time managers have, particularly first-time managers have. I mean, there's so many things. What was successful before and made me successful before, it's going to be my downfall. I mean, it just seems perhaps a bit overwhelming. As a first-time manager, do you have any suggestions of this whole suite of skills I now need to develop? Where do I start? I can't do it all at once.
Yeah, so I think starting with the recognition that the job is different. It's a different job than I had as a programmer, and I need to and I need to make some shifts, and I need to be curious about managing and about what good managing looks like as I was about programming. Secondly, thinking about the best managers that I've ever had and what parts of what they did I want to emulate. And what made them stand out. And I think if you get aligned, if you get synced into that, I think those two things can be really powerful. Mickey, do you want to add anything to that?
Just the converse of that, thinking about the worst managers you've had and what you don't want to be like. That motivated me more than anything. I had a guy who I said, I'm never going to be like him.
Yeah, actually, that's really true. My first manager was a micromanager, and I thought, no, I'm never going to be like him. And so I became a sink or swim manager for a while until I took that training at Apple and realized that there was a sweet spot of delegation and supporting that I really wanted to be. That was the sweet spot where I really wanted my management to be.
Yeah, it's interesting. Some of my role models were the negative role models. I am never going to do what this person did to us or me or my team. We have an interesting comment from Clive here. He says, perhaps surprisingly, leadership training at military academy instills these people management skills. It also teaches how to switch it off and give orders when the plan abruptly changes. So it is common beyond just software development, management, and leadership skills.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a manager working for me when I was a director of engineering at Schwab, who had been in the Marine Corps. And my background is not military, but his background was military. And it was very interesting realizing that the military training and leadership that he had really aligned well with agile, not with command and control, not with telling people what to do, because in warfare, he explained to me, in warfare, when you go into battle, the team has to work together. The team has to have each other's backs. The team, every member of the team has to step up, and it's very much like the model for self-organizing agile teams.
So thank you for that. We're now going to switch gears just a bit. For those of you who are just joining us, we are wrapping up Ron Lichty's first-time manager session, and we're going to switch now over to Nikki Mandels, who's going to do a session on managing remote software development. You can see here on the screen, there's myself, I'm your MC, Ron and Nikki, who have been answering questions. If you haven't had a chance to add questions to our live chat, please do that, and I'll ask them of our two speakers. Ron will stick around, so at the end of Nikki's sessions, if there's still some more questions for Ron, he'll be there to answer them. We have Peter in the background who's running all the controls, and we'll wrap this up at the end. And Joy, who's Peter just went behind the secret curtain again. Joy, who's doing our backup just in case our internet goes down, since we are broadcasting from the desert where the word reliable never goes with the word internet. So Mickey, a very brief introduction to Mickey, and he will give you a little more information in his talk. He's been developing software for 40 years. He started as a system programmer, moved to a tech lead, to a manager, to a VP of engineering, to a CTO, to a COO, to CEO. So a lot of that C-suite in there. And let's turn it over to Mickey's presentation, and we will be back live with you as soon as it's over.